everybody. Welcome to episode 70 of Glass Onion on John Lennon. So this is part 2 of the listener audio questions. I don't imagine you really believed us when we said it was only be one part, quick fire. That wasn't going to happen, let's be honest. So it's medium fire for the second part. So Ghosty's back. Are you ready for this?
I'm ready. Episode 2, finally. Here we go.
Yeah. All right, here we go.
Hello, Anthony. My name is Diarmid, and I'd just like to send in a question for the show. I really enjoy your show, by the way. Thank you very much for it. The question I have is about the relationship between John and Paul, actually. I have an interest in what happened in their relationship or what changed in their relationship after India. I've seen 1 or 2 references in online videos and in newspaper interviews, etc., that seemed to pinpoint some change in their relationship in India or after India. And I think it was noted by Jeff Emerick at one point in his book. So I was wondering, what was this change? What caused it? And has anybody gotten to the bottom of that issue? Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Diarmid, for that. Great question. Yeah, it's interesting. I do believe, is it One Sweet Dream or Another Kind of Mind have been tackling this?
Yes.
To be honest, I've got my hands completely full with podcasts and other things. I don't listen to so many as I used to. But have they surmised anything so far?
Not definitely. It's an area of mystery. And for me, it stems from that conversation. Was it Philip Norman? Who's the one that said to Paul that John Lennon told them that no one hurt me more than Paul McCartney? Who was that author?
I don't know. Maybe Philip Norman, yeah.
Maybe it was Norman. And that Paul actually called the author and said, what? What did I do? I wonder if that's got something to do with it. I mean, I always assumed, because that was right around the time that Yoko was sending him postcards and that he was supposed to be, like George Harrison said, we didn't come here to write the next album. We were supposed to be studying. And I think John was getting deeper and deeper and more wooed by Yoko during that time. And I think his imagination was consumed with her. And that might have been it. But I don't really know. I mean, I don't see Paul having some sort of a personality change or anything like that.
Yeah.
So unless there was some kind of event that we just don't know about, I'm surprised that nobody would have talked about it. I mean, I've never heard McCartney talk about it. And what's funny, that when they come back and they're interviewed by Larry Kane, that famous interview where they're talking about setting up Apple, they seem pretty united there. So
I think they were quite off their heads for that whole trip, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a few books. I think it was more of a kind of stone solidarity, perhaps. I don't know. I think they were always, they're always going to retain a bit of that brothers thing. But I did see the Meeting the Beatles in India documentary. Have you seen that yet? The Paul Saltzman.
No.
Oh, it's amazing. Really good. Because I went to India a couple of years ago, so seeing him and Mark Lewison coming out of Delhi airport, going on the train to Rishikesh is great. But that film is, it's a very positive. And I'm not saying that, it's not sincere, but, he didn't see any arguments in India, let's say. Why do we think Paul left? Is it because he just wanted to dip his toe in the water of meditation and he thought perhaps someone should get back and deal with all the business in London?
I think at that time, I don't think Paul would have committed to one particular thing like that. He just had so much going on. Not like the other Beatles didn't, but I just see Paul having so many varied interests. And he had a whole other life that involved Barry Miles, and he was still in that world. Yeah, so maybe it was just Paul had just had so much going on that he just wanted to get back to his other life.
And maybe he didn't want to escape it, because I really feel as time goes on, I really feel that you could split the Beatles in two, John and George on one side, Paul and Ringo on the other, in that Paul and Ringo, even now, they don't seem to mind the showbiz thing. They're quite at home with it. I think John and George sort of hated it, possibly because of LSD. I think that opened it up for them. I think Paul didn't want to escape, for a busy, industrious guy who's fairly happy with his life in London. He probably didn't want to be away that long. Perhaps he thought meditation was kind of keeping him away. I don't know. He just wanted to dip his toe in the water and have a holiday in India. I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Right. And I don't know if you've ever seen the documentary Going Underground. the documentary film
Oh.
about McCartney and the underground art scene in the mid-'60s.
No, I put the trailer on one of the episodes because I had someone on who was talking about that.
It's a really good documentary that speaks to his involvement, which was pretty extensive. I mean, we know Paul's a workaholic, but to have this whole other, it's almost like that would be someone else's career if they weren't a Beatle, you know. A lot of it was bankrolling other people's projects, but, you know, he's making these experimental films and everything. And, you know, I can see where he would want to get back to that. He's got a lot happening in London, whereas John is just in the, not just in the suburbs being a father. That sounds like I'm denigrating fatherhood. But you get the idea. He's not really a mover and shaker in London. He's got responsibilities. But it struck me that Paul was having this other life outside of the Beatles, and John in the Hunter Davies book says that his only friends, his only real close friends are the Beatles. Of course, he's got Pete Shotton and other people like that. But it's interesting that Paul excluded John from that avant-garde world that he was getting into. And I don't know if it was done with the thought of, well, John can't be part of it because he's got a wife and a kid and he's got a family life and I'm a swinging bachelor and I can do what I want. Or it was a case of Paul thinking, I want to have this life outside of these guys that I'm constantly around. I need to have some other kind of interests. You know, I need to have a whole different set of friends. Not only did Yoko represent a chance for John to get away from, you know, his family situation, but also it was his entree into that world. Sort of like, well, now, you know, I can make my avant-garde films and I can do my stuff and you're not a part of it. So maybe that was the beginning of some of the division there.
I've always been a bit uncomfortable with this idea that John Lennon was stuck having a normal family life, nice, boring suburban life, because I really don't think his life there was anything we would consider normal. I mean, Cynthia's book seems to suggest that they were fairly happy domestically till about 65, perhaps. And she blames it on drugs, sort of drugs and pressure, I suppose. So I guess LSD was like the other woman. And Paul's got saddled with this, he needs the Beatles more than the others. I think a lot of the revisionist research is saying that maybe it was John who needed them. And I don't remember the exact quote, but in Hunter Davies, doesn't he say something like, if I've been away from the others for a few weeks, I start to forget who I am? Did he say something like that?
Yeah.
I mean, that's such an amazing quote. And the only other thing was, are you aware of that Paul was recording William Burroughs in that Montague Square flat, which seemed to see a hell of a lot of action. Jimi Hendrix was there. Cynthia and Julian even lived there. John and Yoko were at Kenwood and Cynthia was at Montague Square, and then they swapped. But Paul apparently, recorded some spoken what? Paul recorded some spoken word there.
Well, maybe. But yeah, I could see where John would be, because as you say, this sort of, you know, sweet domestic life was just not for him and was never going to be for him. So what a struggle that would have been. Maybe in a way, it kind of foreshadows a struggle that he may have had later on at the Dakota, trying to maintain that domesticity that he was certainly pushing to the press.
I mean, I know Goldman's much maligned, but there's some quite interesting passages about him talking about the mid-'60s and Lennon's hold up at Kenwood. It's not so much a boring domestic life as a kind of, I think he spent a lot of his adult life fairly depressed, I would say. And he obviously didn't help himself with, you know, the sort of self-abuse and self-medication. A lot of it is energy as well. You know, I think Paul looked after himself. He was a bit more chipper person in general. John always seemed to be quite low energy a lot of the time, and he didn't, you know, obviously the hash and everything, he'd often go like days without sleep as well, apparently. So I think it might have been an energy thing, like he couldn't be bothered to go into the city.
But then when he embarks with Yoko on the peace campaign, I mean, they go on a publicity blitz, the likes of which, you know, no one's ever seen. But then again, it was sort of like, you know, high energy, and the end product was that they were staying in bed. So
yeah, it's interesting. No, I think she definitely, that's what I mean. That's why I've said on the show a lot of times, I don't buy the idea that their whole relationship was a myth. I think it was very real until about 74. That's where I start to get a bit skeptical, where you get the sort of Elliot Mintz / Yoko version of things. I think in the mid-'60s, I think he was just like fairly profoundly depressed, to be honest. And like I say, not helping himself. Yeah, and like you said, Paul, I think, he wanted a life outside the Beatles. He didn't need the Beatles that much,
Well, it's funny, in the 70s, he almost was going so far as to deny ever being in them, because he didn't want to talk about them. And he had that Muhammad Ali rhyme that he would always give reporters when they would ask about the Beatles getting back together. And it was, the Beatles broke up in 69, and since then they've been doing fine. Right. And if that question don't cease, ain't nobody going to get no peace. That was his stock answer.
You didn't get it from Muhammad Ali, but you made it up.
No, he just did it in the style of,
My favorite Muhammad Ali rhyme is, he fought Foreman in 74 in Zaire. You know about that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was just after Watergate. And he said, if you thought the world was surprised when Nixon resigned, wait till I kick Foreman's behind. That's one of his great lines.
But then again, in 69 going into 70, Paul's the guy who vanishes off the face of the earth and, goes up to Scotland with Linda and is living, sort of the Mr. Natural lifestyle there, with a place with no running water and, sort of reveling in squalor for months at a time and boozing it up. The Paul is dead stuff starts around that time, and he's not around to answer to it because he's shunned showbiz at that point. So, these guys are so multifaceted, like anybody else, really. I don't think there are any hard and fast answers regarding this stuff, or Lennon and McCartney's, the dissolution of their tightness. And again, I think I might have said this on the Elvis discussion that we had. Part of the reason that the story of the Beatles continues to enthrall is I think that we use it to examine what happens in our own lives. It's like, I was really close with those guys from college, and we were so tight, and I thought these guys were going to be my best friends forever. And we didn't have a fight or anything, but, I just moved on. I don't see them anymore. And when I do see them, it's like, it can never be the same again. And we can have dinner, but we're not close like we were. And we use the story of the Beatles to continually relive what the hell went wrong in our lives.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing where we can see them having things which are quite ordinary, but of course in their lives, because everything was 10 times more intense than a quote-unquote normal life, we can kind of relate to it, but then we can think, wow, can you imagine being John Lennon in 1968? It must have been crazy. Still doing ordinary things, but, he's claiming to be Jesus Christ, he's doing copious amounts of LSD, etc.
Right.
So, circling back to the question, it's a mystery, I think the Beatles story, all these podcasts will keep going, because I'm firmly of the belief that we probably don't know anything, really. We probably only know like 20%. It's kind of like the world, I've been doing this Coleman and Goldman continuum. On my other podcast, Life and Life Only, I'm about to do a series on propaganda. And I'm thinking when I have a guest on, I should ask where they stand on the mainstream versus conspiracy continuum. Are we being told everything we need to know, or are we being told nothing we need to know? And where do you stand on that scale? I go for the Socratic thing. Wisdom is knowing what you don't know. So,
it's funny. I just finished listening to something that I had started to listen to during the pandemic. It's easier for me to read books than it is to listen to audiobooks, because there's so much to compete with in terms of audio. But I just finished listening to the book about David Lynch that David Lynch participated in, called Room to Dream. And at the end of the book, and this is a big book, and it was, the audio book was 16 hours or something like that. And at the end of it, he says, this book doesn't even scratch the surface. And you couldn't even fit in all the things that happen and the feelings that you have and the thoughts that go through your head in a day, one day, in a book like this. It's why that Beatle engine just keeps going, because we're always trying to find out. We always want to know, and we're never going to know.
Yeah, and this is why I rail against mainstream media, and I'm on a mission to try and enlighten people on my other podcasts. In that, I don't think mainstream media is even telling us even a tiny fraction of what we need to know. And there's all these things that have been found out. People can say what they like about the internet. So, there's lots of theories, and there's also loads of good research on there as well. And we are slowly finding, more and more people are waking up to the fact that we are not being told a fraction of what goes on. And I think the Beatles story kind of mirrors that. And not in the case of the Beatles, I don't think like authors are deceiving us. I'm just saying that if you think about those events, 7, 8, 10 years, and if every day of those is eventful, then, just ask Mark Lewison, he's working full time.
Right.
He puts in like 8-hour days of the Beatles.
Yeah.
It's absolutely incredible.
Think about this, though. All the things the Beatles did that we endlessly talk about, and just think about how the story of the Beatles is presented and how it keeps changing. It's remarkable, even thinking back to the 80s when the first real serious literature about the Beatles was coming out, and just how different that story is today and how different that story is going to be in 10 or 15 years from now. Let's hope we're around to see it so we can go, I remember Mark Lewison, and tune in, and we'll be those guys railing against how the story's now being told or now perceived. I just heard on something about the Beatles, there's a plug for Robert's show, that McCartney recently said that the story of he and John watching Saturday Night Live and not deciding to go down and get the money that was offered to them, that story's not true. McCartney said that never actually happened. That just puts a huge dent in what we thought we knew about John and Paul in the 70s.
That's what I'm talking about.
Right,
we don't know squat.
Yeah.
But we can talk about it, and it's fun, and this is great.
Yeah.
Well, having Caitlin Hare on the show, Marty Hare's daughter,
Yeah.
it was so lovely. I mean, she was only like 5 years old. She kept apologizing and saying, I'm sorry I wasn't older. And I said, it's your parents' fault, don't worry. She just had these little nuggets. She was telling me just these little fleeting memories from a 5-6-year-old. But excitingly, it's a bit of an exclusive. Her brother, who is a few years older than her, was also around in like Cold Spring Harbor and El Solano. Yeah, he's willing to talk to me at some point. She's going to hook me up, so that'll be interesting. So we're going to get lots and lots of first-hand, yeah. Anyway, Diarmuid, was that a long enough answer to your question? Yeah, so much for quick fire, eh? But no, I'm loving this. Absolutely fantastic. So thanks for that question. Well, the next contender, the next listener, has actually got 4 questions. I think it's...
All right.
Hello, Antony. This is Kevin. I am from the heartland of America, Des Moines, Iowa. I wanted to enter my submission of the question. I'm probably going to cheat a little bit here because instead of one funny or thought-provoking question, I have a few minor ones. As I stopped thinking of a question, a couple did come flooding in, so I'll try to make this brief. First question is, what would be the era of the Beatles that if somebody that wasn't familiar, besides like the hits, and of course they get sick of the, I Want to Hold Your Hand, Yesterday, Yellow Submarine, here's what epitomizes the Beatles. What era would that be? Because every year is very different, and no other band can say that. Like every year has a distinct sound, in my opinion. Second question, and I'm someone that likes to make a lot of lists, like a set list. If they had a reunion tour in the 90s or something, or late 80s, what would that have looked like? I'm thinking 90s because of the anthology. What would that set list look like? I actually made one, and I also I've made playlists for what their 1970 album would be if they continued on. But that does transition into my question. Is it better that they didn't continue on, like 1970? Well, they could have got a couple other good albums out of, 1970, 71 if you would have combined their amazing solo material for those first couple of years. Is it better that they just stopped when they did and they didn't overstay their welcome and couldn't have too many stinkers and they just went out on top? Is that better that they broke up when they did? The old tried and true, if you had a time machine question, this is more Lennon specific. Lately, I feel like maybe his legacy has been more cemented by the events that occurred, and it's painted him in a positive light, and maybe it was better not just for Lennon, but for the Beatles in general and the aura that they went out on top, they never had a chance to get together, and, again, like I said, overstay their welcome and have a lot of duds in the 80s like a lot of 60s and 70s artists had. So what are your thoughts on that? Would you go back and stop that murder from happening and see what happens, and see if Lennon ages gracefully or doesn't? I'm very intrigued and riveted on the 75 to 80 period and that whole time frame, just as yourself. So keep up the good work. Keep up the podcast. I hope you have enough material to keep it going. You can never talk enough Lennon, especially the 75 to 80 period. And I enjoy listening to what your answers would be. Thank you.
So what do we think then? Which era epitomizes the Beatles? Let's tackle that one first.
For me, I'd say 65 into 66, maybe more 66. It's just the right blend of, a bit of their early look and John and Paul harmonizing, which they sort of ceased doing a lot afterwards. And it's certainly, I think, the sound of tracks like Rain and Paperback Writer seem to have the most legs going into, the 90s. And of course, I think about Oasis and groups like that that based their entire careers around that period of the Beatles. But when I think of the Beatles, I think of the Beatles in 66 or, I'm 65. Yeah, I could see that. But I think of them really 66 as the definitive era, Rubber Soul into Revolver.
I hate to be unoriginal, but I'm going to agree with that. I'm going to say Rubber Soul, in fact, because I think if you take the Pepper era and Revolver to some extent, I always go by, all right, I think the Beatles in the end created good songwriting and good songs. So the stuff like the Indian things and the things which you couldn't really reproduce live, although arguably you could reproduce anything live now, I think the fundamentals of them is songwriting. So I always think, what ones could I play on my guitar? And I think I said earlier, actually, in part one, Rubber Soul is the best for playing on the guitar. But it's also experimental because it's not just love songs. So they've transcended that. So you've got stuff like Girl. And again, to mention Beatles Naked, Richard Buskin and the other guys, they just did a really interesting dissection of Girl. Yeah, and you've got the Girl, you've got the sound that sounds like a balalaika, you've got the bark thing on it, In My Life. So I think I don't think any one era sums them up, but I'd just say Rubber Soul because it's that nice bridge. Fundamentally, I think the Beatles are about great songs. And because I'm kind of predominantly acoustic guitarist, that's why I love Dylan. One of the reasons I love Dylan so much is that he didn't really need any finery attached to any of his songs.
Right.
So that's the reason why Revolver has never been my number one Beatles album. It's always been up there, either 2 or 3, possibly 4. But I'm a bit biased for just pure songs that you could just play on a guitar. So that's my reasoning.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah. Right. So Kevin's other question was, what would be the set list for a possible reunion? Let's just play with this a little bit. So obviously early 70s, you could have had a reunion. They could have taken a couple of years off. We've seen lots of people have produced albums of all their solo stuff put together, which just sounds amazing. Right. If you could have got them together to even just to play sideman for each other, that would have been great. But let's just say early 80s, let's say. So they've got the whole Beatles canon. What do you think they might have played?
I would think that they probably would have geared more of the show toward the later material rather than the earlier material. Isn't it strange? I think for some reason, even though the later material, yes, it's got orchestras and everything that's tough to reproduce on stage, I have a feeling it would be easier for them to do than to do something like She Loves You. Yeah.
I mean, that was out of date quickly. I mean, there's that amazing thing on the Hollywood Bowl where John Lennon says we're going to play an oldie.
Right.
And they play She Loves You. And it really does seem, by 65, if you think of Help and Rubber Soul and Ticket to Ride and Yesterday and all that, it really is just seems like way out of date. I feel like they might have played I Want to Hold Your Hand. I don't know, John had a soft spot for that. So,
well, if he wanted to do a slow version of Help, I don't know if he would have done that at a Beatles reunion concert or if that would have gotten off the ground, but I know that was an idea that he had talked about.
Well, there's a demo from 1970, isn't there, of him on the piano doing that?
Right. I know when Paul plays live, and when he was doing the concert for Campuchia, he was doing Got to Get You Into My Life. I mean, that gives you a sort of an idea of where he was headed in terms of playing Beatles music. And I noticed that in his solo concerts, certainly in the 80s and 90s, he favored a lot of Revolver material. He played Here, There, and Everywhere, Got to Get You Into My Life, Eleanor Rigby. It would have been great had the Beatles all been around and active in the 90s when it became in vogue to perform an entire album in its entirety.
Yeah.
That would have been great to hear.
And the 60s, of course, became very trendy again, didn't they?
Right, exactly.
Yeah. I could definitely see them doing some White Album back in the USSR birthday.
Right.
They would have remembered having a good time. Birthday, the famous Girl Can't Help It, that whole story. And Yeah Blues, they did it at the
Sure.
John did it at the Rock and Roll Circus, so that would have been good. But yeah, I can't see them doing really anything pre-65 other than Want to Hold Your Hand. They might have done rock and roll, but I tell you what I would have liked. I don't know. I had a Led Zeppelin box set. They did a concert in 75. Oh, where was it? It wasn't Nebworth. Maybe it was Earl's Court.
Okay.
And they do like a sit-down acoustic set, sort of pre-MTV Unplugged. I'd love to see the Beatles do that with literally 3 acoustics. I mean, it'd be kind of like they were doing in India, really, in a way. Get Ringo on the bongos or something.
Right.
So I could see
Slapping
that.
his knees.
Yeah, so I could see that happening. I feel like rock was like the glue. They could have done some early rock and roll, but I feel rock is the glue that would have held them together.
Well, they could have done Twist and Shout. They could have done Long Tall Sally. They probably would have been okay with the covers,
Yeah, because it's sort of neutral in a way, isn't it? In a funny way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is it good that the Beatles broke up? That was the other question. Did they break up at the right time?
You want to take that one?
I mean, I'm going to say yes. I mean, just because the more I read, the more it seems almost impossible that they would have really continued. There was so much baggage that was already accumulated. And, you can compare them to the Stones, but, if there's any Stones fans listening, 1968 to 72, the Stones were just like unbelievable, really amazing. But if you go to their concerts, I don't think the crowd want to hear much beyond 72, 73, maybe Start Me Up and a couple of other ones.
Right.
So I'm going to just say yes. I don't know if I can be fully objective about that, but it just seems so perfect that they broke up. They also broke up right at the end of the 60s.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'll also be unoriginal. Completely agree. I was never one of these people who thought of it as a great tragedy. I hate to say it. Yeah. It just seemed like natural for me that they would break up. It just, not with the rancor, that's unfortunate. It would have been great if they amicably split, but I think they ended at exactly the right time. You couldn't have picked a better ending than the end, on Abbey Road and the little joke of Her Majesty at the end. It's perfect. I hate to use that word, but it's predestined almost.
Yeah.
It's just perfect. And I would hate to have had them continue on and, then you have somebody drop out and then another guy joins the band. And then all due respect to the Stones, they really should have packed it in a long time ago, but that's another podcast.
They just enjoy it, don't they? I mean, they don't make many albums anymore. They made that blues one. Made that blues one recently. That was pretty good. But
I have that, yeah.
Yeah. Another sort of a hypothetical, this is quite interesting. If the Beatles had toured as the Stones did in 69 when the game had totally changed and the audience could hear them, would they have cut the mustard, so to speak? Or would they have been a bit passé? That's always an interesting one.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, they really would have had to have stepped up their game.
Absolutely.
And I don't know if they had the will to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we have the rooftop, but the weird thing about the rooftop, incidentally, you've probably seen the announcement, haven't you?
I did. I saw it.
Yeah. But I think it was announced last year as well that we were going to get the whole rooftop, something like 40 minutes. But it's a shame, really, because they're just mostly doing multiple versions of the same songs. Obviously, they're trying to capture them for this film.
Right.
But it would be really interesting. Could they go back and do it an hour or an hour and a half? Obviously, they used to do hours and hours in Hamburg, but that was a different story. Right. So that's interesting. Yeah. Anyway, I think to answer the question, we're glad they split up. The other weird thing, of course, is that they had one session on the 3rd of January, 1970. How amazing is that?
Right.
They had one session in the 70s. That's what makes it seem perfect.
And it's I Me Mine, right?
Yeah, I Me Mine, yeah.
And John's not there. So when they pick it up again years later, eerily, John's not there again.
Absolutely, yeah. The Three Tools. It's like they took a 24-year break and then got back together. Right. The last one, would you go back in time and stop John Lennon's murder? And I think we're going to say yes to that.
Yes, of course.
What would John Lennon's 1980s have been like? I'm sure this is another thing we've endlessly speculated on, but let's do it again.
Yeah, John Lennon's 1980s, I mean, they probably would have been like every other 60s artist's 1980s. It seems like a lot of them got really lost. You had Dylan, of course, making albums, some of them like Down in the Groove. So why even release it? And, I love Dylan. I can find greatness in everything, but that's a tough listen. McCartney goes off and does Give My Regards to Broad Street. I mean, there are all sorts of problems with a lot of the 60s acts. So hopefully John Lennon would have been able to produce good music without getting wrapped up in music videos and wanting to compete with Madonna or something like that. But, Milk, the sessions that eventually were released as Milk and Honey point to a harder edge than we got on Double Fantasy. I mean, I know it's obviously all around the same period, but I think if he had gone more in that direction, he would have been, I brought up Elvis Costello before, but he would have been kind of in that same bag, maybe a little more new wavy.
Yeah. It just seems that maybe it's just something to do with the 80s almost being the end of the 60s, really. I mean, if you think politically, this is for my other podcast, really, but the 80s was basically the decade where business took over, all the deregulation. And obviously John Lennon heralding the 80s, unfortunately, with his murder. It's almost as if, unwillingly, he almost ushered in, the death of the 60s, all the idealism and everything. And you suddenly got this just that, you saw with the film industry, Heaven's Gate was almost like the last chance saloon for the Maverick, and then
right.
It's like the corporations said, oh, we're not going to let people have a chance anymore. We're going to be safe with our money, so we're going to go for formula. So I think in music, in film, and in politics, I think the 80s was kind of the death of the 60s.
Although that was sort of my time as a teenager. In the worlds of punk and new wave, it was incredibly exciting and fresh in the DIY aesthetic. And, I think for an established 60s act, that might have been the case. I don't think there was any real world for them to belong to, unless they were Nico or somebody like that, who were already on the fringes. But there was a lot happening musically in the 80s that was pretty radical. I just don't think any of the 60s acts would have been accepted. As I certainly know from my teenage years, the thought was, we don't want to hear those old bastards. It was like, we've got our own heroes. We're into Husker Du, I don't want to hear from anybody. I wasn't like that because I always enjoyed 60s music. I liked them both, but there was a kind of take a hike grandpa attitude.
I suppose what I'm talking about is mainstream pop, because I totally agree. Like, you take any decade of music, I mean, there's always great music being made. It's just how near to the mainstream it reaches. So I'm saying McCartney, Dylan, Bowie, who else?
God, Bowie had some really bad records in the 80s.
And Bowie was obviously very edgy, but he's still a mainstream artist. Most of his albums are mainstream friendly, if they're good. I mean, if they're bad albums, then no one's going to like them. Same with Bob Dylan, All right, let's move on. Right, we've got another recording now. So this one is on location. You ready for this? Here we go.
Sure.
Hey, Anthony, this is Kid O'Toole, normally from Chicago, but this time coming to you from Grace Bay Beach in Providenciales, Turks and Caicos Islands. And my question is one that has come up recently once again on the Facebook rounds. Who is holding that note on A Day in the Life? Some people say it's Paul, some people say it's John. I have thought all these years that it's John. I think that nasal tone is unmistakably John. Some people are saying it's Paul. So I'm counting on you to end this debate once and for all. Who is it?
So, yes, thank you, Kit, for rubbing in the fact that you're in the Turks and Caicos Islands.
And I'm in rainy life.
Well, it was raining, actually.
Okay.
She said that. So anyway, I hope she had a nice time. I guess she's back by now. But thanks for that, Kit. Okay. So basically, I guess we're going to direct listeners to the YouTube channel. You Can't Unhear This. Have you seen that video?
Yes.
Go on, you go first.
Well, I mean, I'm of the opinion that it's Paul. I've seen the evidence, and there was a thread about this on the Steve Hoffman forums, which is where all the music nerds hang out, like me. And I don't know if it was Paul's attempt at trying to match John or sound like John. It might have just been the way it was recorded. But I do believe it is Paul hitting that note. I know that Paul can sound like John when he wants to. Real Love, the Threedles single, Paul is doubling John on that. People don't realize that. And he can do from testimonials, people that have been around him, he can do a pretty note-perfect John Lennon impression. So I do think it's Paul. I don't know if it makes any difference to the song to people, but I do think it's Paul.
On the video, they compare it to the beginning of Lovely Rita.
Yes. Yep.
It really, really sounds similar. It's interesting because it's either the end of the bridge or the beginning of the last verse. It's obviously neither. It's in the middle, but it could be either. It's interesting. I have a very distinct memory for certain things. And I remember because John Lennon had this sort of cool psychedelic image, and unless you knew any better, you didn't think Paul was as psychedelic. Obviously this is years ago. And I always thought, John Lennon loved Alice in Wonderland. It all seems to fit this image, which definitely was put out there. Paul actually as well liked Alice in Wonderland, believe it or not,
Right.
It just seemed to be so John Lennon. That sort of, that kind of psychedelic kind of voice, So I just always thought it was him. But listening again, can't be absolutely sure, but I would go for Paul. Yeah, it's kind of like they did another video, another thing that puzzled me. Who sings "She Loves You" at the end of "All You Need Is Love"? Because you kind of you kind of see both of them singing it, and I don't think they even found a definitive answer to that. So
I always thought it was John, and then doesn't Paul lip sync it on the Our World
on the video? Yeah, maybe.
Yeah,
I haven't seen their video for a while of that one, but I don't know if that's a definitive answer. In my head, it's definitive.
Yeah, there you go.
Anyway, yeah, so we're going for Paul there. Okay, next one. So we're back in continental Europe again. Here we go.
All right.
Hi, I'm Alfonso from Italy, currently living in Brussels, Belgium, and my question is, who is the artist that had the biggest influence on Beatles' music and work?
All right. Well, let me just start by saying Complete Beatles was a massive documentary for me. I don't think I watched it more than 300 times, probably only about 250. And along with Imagine 88, I remember I got those exactly the same time, and it was just like ad infinitum. And whenever you saw like Beatles documentaries, radio, TV, there was always this group of 50s artists headed by Elvis, Chuck, Buddy Holly, Gene Vincent, the Everleys, who else? Eddie Cochran, Carl Perkins.
Carl Perkins, sure. Little Richard.
Of course, Jerry Lee Lewis as well.
Right.
It's funny, with Elvis, I'm not sure. It's funny that they never recorded any of his songs in the studio.
Yeah.
So they did live at the BBC. Was his influence perhaps a bit more symbolic?
I think so. I think they appreciated those records, and he became, like Paul said, the Messiah has arrived, when they saw Elvis. I know they jammed on Elvis tunes when they were in the studio, because there's certainly some of that floating around. But I don't know. Maybe there's a feeling that he's doing something that we couldn't possibly do. And so they just gravitated more toward Everly Brothers, which seemed attainable, right? And Buddy Holly, which seemed attainable. Certainly, here's this guy with glasses, I'm sure John sees parallels with that. I know they tried their best with their Elvis hairstyles, but they were never going to really be able to pull something like that off, although they can do impressions, as John famously did and Paul did to some degree. But I would say Buddy Holly and then Dylan would be the two that would vie for top influences.
Sure, yeah. Buddy Holly's a good shout. There's a nice clip of George Harrison, actually. It's a radio thing, I think, but you can hear him with his guitar talking about, just the fact Buddy Holly had I think one of his big hits has 2 chords. Maybe. I can't remember, but obviously they did That'll Be the Day. So that's a good shout. I think it's almost like giving permission to write simple songs and wear glasses. It's that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Buddy Holly still looked kind of cool. He looked sort of a bit bookish. He's almost like the sort of librarian version of Elvis,
Right. And of course, Crickets becomes Beatles. So
of course, yeah, absolutely. What else have we got? Well, obviously the Everleys. I mean, you've got the...
Sure.
Is it Two of Us where he says, "Take it, Phil," or something for the song?
Yeah.
You can't play that down. And then I think the ones sort of on the fringes, I think John fancied himself as Gene Vincent, again, more image-wise. And Bebop Alluda's obviously massive. And then what do you think, Chuck Berry? Do you think like maybe the narrative idea? Or writing your own songs, obviously, like Buddy Holly?
Right. Yeah. I mean, Chuck, certainly. I know that famous quote from Lennon, if you had to give rock and roll a name, you'd call it Chuck Berry. He didn't actually say that. He read it off a cue card and then agreed with it. Somebody at the Mike Douglas show had actually written that. But it's funny how these quotes are attributed. It's better than some of the other ones that you're floating around with, John.
Yeah.
But it's funny. I would also say, well, I mean, there's just loads of influences, but the biggest ones, yeah, Buddy Holly, Little Richard, certainly for Paul. Maybe it breaks down into individuals because Carl Perkins would be a big one for George.
Oh, who's the other guy? The country guitarist. What's his name? Chet Atkins.
Oh, Chet Atkins, sure.
Massive for George, yeah, absolutely. The rockabilly. So I think for maybe John and Paul as songwriters, I'd say definitely Buddy, and then obviously Dylan more for John.
Right.
And then maybe Jerry Lee and Elvis more symbolic, perhaps.
And then there was a brief window of time there where the Beach Boys were an influence around Pet Sounds and Good Vibrations.
Yeah. Any shadows? Oh, well, obviously
they Cry for a Shadow, yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
twangy guitar.
Yeah, I know that Paul has said that Jet Harris was a big inspiration for him as a bass player. That's really about it.
Oh, and he name-checked the Motown guy. He's a really good Motown.
James Jamerson?
Yeah, that's it, James Jamerson, yeah. Wow, that's a lot there, yeah. Thanks for that one, Alfonso. All right, next one. I think we're back in England again now.
Hi, my name's Matt, and I'm talking to you from Hampshire in England. My question is about Bernard Purdey. He was a very precise drummer who worked with people like Aretha Franklin and B.B. King. He claimed that he played on 21 of the early Beatles recordings and that Ringo never played on anything. Now, I have no idea about this, but I was hoping to hear your thoughts. Thank you very much.
All right, I think I'm going to give you this one, Ghosty.
Okay, well, Purdey is a local guy. He lives not too far from where I am and frequents a lot of the same record stores. And in fact, there was a post on Facebook today of him posing in a store with a store that I go to. He's a familiar face. That claim is no longer on his website. I think someone eventually got to him regarding that. The best that anyone can come up with regarding that claim is that it's not confirmed, but he may have been brought in to overdub on the 61 Tony Sheridan recordings that were eventually released on the Atlantic label or Atco label here in the U.S. And that would be the aforementioned Cry for a Shadow and Ain't She Sweet and My Bonnie and things like that. And he evidently, Pete Best played the drums on that, but he overdubbed percussion on top of those recordings. Or there were a multitude of knockoff Beatle products, by groups like the Bugs or things like that. And it's possible that he may have been a session musician on that. Now, he had claimed that he played on a song that goes, yeah, 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 but I've read that some people were surmising that he might be thinking of Ya Ya, which is one of those 61 recordings. So it's likely that he did work on that. I don't know. I just had a conversation with a friend of mine who's a writer for USA Today, and we have a big email chain going back and forth with a bunch of other people discussing this very topic of session musicians who embellish their careers, people that have wonderful careers, highly esteemed, and there'd be no reason for them to make something up. And clearly, they've either got their facts totally wrong or they're being devious. And there's a famous singer claiming that they sang on a record. I won't mention her name, and she did not sing on this record. And there are lots of other studio musicians too. And maybe the thinking is because they were kind of working in the shadows and they were doing a lot of work that went unappreciated for years, they're trying to overcompensate for that. But that's no excuse for lying. So
yeah, I mean, I have no idea why he said that. I mean, I just know that it was fairly standard have like session. Jimmy Page gets all kinds of things get attributed to Jimmy Page. Do you know for a fact which big hits he played on?
Jimmy Page?
Yeah, because he was obviously a session player who's floating around. I'm just trying to make the point that nowadays, modern rock bands, I don't think would ever entertain the idea that you get someone in to play the drums for them, but or guitar.
Well, I'm pretty sure he played on Downtown by Petula Clark, and he played on a bunch of Tom Jones records.
Yeah, but did he play on any Kinks or Who? Do you know by any chance?
I know that, according to Dave Davies, and that's a sticking point for him, that he does not play on "You Really Got Me," and he does not play the solo.
Right.
I know that Clem Catini, the session drummer, played all over a Kinks record, replacing Mick Avery, and I can't remember which one it was.
Right.
I know that session musicians played on the Herman's Hermits albums, because I interviewed a bunch of them that played. I interviewed Vic Flick and Clem, well, two, not a bunch. I shouldn't say that. Two. Mm-hmm. And we went through the whole list of records that they played on. Clem Catini plays on tracks that were released as Rolling Stones songs. So a lot of that was going on. It's possible that Jimmy Page played on some kind of a Kinks record. I just don't think it was "You Really Got Me."
Yeah. What was the other one I was thinking of? I think the Byrds had session players.
Oh, yeah. They have the Wrecking Crew on Mr. Tambourine Man.
Of course they did,
McGuinn is the only member of the band playing.
Right, the 12-string. Yeah, of course.
All right. I have to pause it again to run to the bathroom.
The call of nature.
This is just like the call of nature has hit me. So hang on.
I'm going to talk to the audience.
I'm not going anywhere. All right.
Well, we're back again. I feel like the show was getting too smooth, so I'm going to talk to you now. It's just you and me. So Ghosty is off for a break here. I hope you're enjoying the show so far. We are obviously branching off a little bit. We're trying to answer the questions, but we're seeing what tangents come up to get some of that precious Beatle information out there. I've been suffering from Beatle information fatigue. I was on a show, Luke's English podcast. He did the question about the tuba in part 1. And I was explaining to him that if Beatles and John Lennon knowledge was alcohol, sometimes I feel like I've drunk myself sober. I don't know if any other Beatles podcasters ever think that as well. You absorb so much knowledge, you get back to, where Socrates was at, You gain more wisdom to realize that you don't know anything. Anyway.
Yeah, I'm going to get quite the reputation on this podcast of the guy with the weak bladder.
I was talking to the audience. I'll leave a little bit of it in. Yeah, so in conclusion, are there any songs that we actually know for sure Bernard Purdey played on? Beatles songs?
Not really. Everything is speculative. There's, the session logs don't exist for those Atco releases. So we don't even know if he really played on them. It's just assumed that he did because someone overdubbed percussion on those recordings. So it's likely that he did it, because for him to have that memory, unless he's completely lying, in which case, why? Why do this? There's so many session musicians who have no need to do this, but do this. Why would he make that up? And why the slam at Ringo? There is a little bit of I don't know. Buddy Rich said negative things about Ringo. There does seem to be this idea. Well, there's always been this idea that Ringo wasn't any good, or he was along for the ride, or to try and disparage Ringo. And it's out of line for me. Yeah.
I think we know there's one or two songs where I think Paul added an extra hi-hat. So, it's probably like a lot of these things, there's a little kernel of truth that's somehow got escalated into something bigger. Anyway, all right. We've got a real-life Liverpudlian coming up next.
Okay,
here we go.
Hi, Anthony. This is Mick Ord here. Got one question for you. What do you think Lennon and Jack Douglas spoke about in their last night together in the studio? Jack Douglas has said on many occasions that he erased a conversation he and Lennon had because it was so creepy. Any speculation as to what it was about? I'd be really interested. Let's know. Bye.
So that was Mick Ord, who I've become good friends with since he was on the show last year. And he was actually head of Radio Merseyside and has interviewed Jack Douglas. And I believe you have as well, Ghosty. So I'm sure Jack revealed a lot to you about this, but you're keeping it to yourself, aren't you? Did he reveal anything about this? I'm guessing not.
No, I mean, I didn't even know about this until after I interviewed him. I have no idea what could have been on there. I mean, but why even say it? Why even put it out there that you had this conversation and it was so heinous or disturbing you erased it, and that you're not going to tell anybody? It's like going around saying, I've got the greatest news in the world and I'm not telling anybody. Or in this case, it's I've got the worst news in the world, but I'm not telling a soul. I don't know what that accomplishes, but I have no idea what it could have been. I mean, some people have speculated. John was saying he was going to divorce Yoko, but I don't think that would be enough that you'd want to destroy the tape.
Yeah. There is an issue over death premonitions, and Fred Seaman definitely in his book, and I'm sure a couple of other people have mentioned that John had said something, and Fred Seaman's uncle Norman was shot and survived, and apparently John was insatiably pumping him for information, I mean, even though he'd had a bad experience with someone else who knew what it was like to be dead, if you know what I mean, Peter Fonda.
Yeah.
And then we get, there's so many eerie things with the Beatles, but one of the things is of course, there's a couple of references to being shot. He said to the bedding, we're willing to be the world's clowns because Kennedy, Martin Luther King and Gandhi, all the serious people got shot. And then, of course, you got Come Together, which I always heard as shoom, doo, doo, doo.
Right.
And then we find out years later from the isolated tracks, he's singing Shoot Me. I mean, how bizarre can you get? But then...
And then you've got that clip that they show in the Imagine 88 film where a spirit medium says, I got in touch with Brian Epstein and you're going to be assassinated. I mentioned that Knees Go to book, Lennon Prophecy book, and I'm sure a lot of that's in there as well. I don't know. I mean, I just have no idea what's on that tape. I'm sure somebody must know other than Jack Douglas, but it's like that author who said that John said about Paul, no one's hurt me more than Paul. And then Paul called the author and said, well, what was it? And the author, so I can't tell you.
I think that was Philip Norman, actually.
It wasn't Norman? Yeah.
I think so, yeah.
So it's like, why even say it if you're not going to
why tantalize us? Why tantalize us with it? Talking of Imagine 88, there is a weird clip at the end where Yoko says, there was a feeling of premonition, and she told him to go back to Bermuda. I mean, there's other eerie things about that night. Apparently, the limousine usually drove into the Dakota. I'm not sure if that's right. I don't know how big the entrance is. So, the more conspiratorial side of it, I had a guy on who was talking about that, and he did a whole show about it.
Right.
Why did the limo driver park outside? And again, I have no idea if that's true. One thing I would say is that December the 8th, it's amazing that on this momentous for all the wrong reasons day, John Lennon was so exposed in the sense of he did a long interview with Dave Sholin. We've got that amazing picture by Annie Leibovitz of John naked in the fetal position, which I think is one of the great rock photos. I don't think a lot of couples, well, particularly John, because he was the naked one, would have had the courage to do that. You can call it courage or indulgence. But what I was going to say was that there's nothing in John Lennon's behaviour that day, the stuff with Dave Sholin, there's no hint or there's no even like any weird cryptic comments that gives any idea that he thought his life was going to end that day. So I'm fairly confident that he didn't. But I think there's definitely more to explore or more to theoretically know, because maybe we're never going to know, probably going to never know about that in particular.
Right.
I'm sure there's more unexplored territory in John Lennon 1980. That's why we've spent so much time on it. Anyway, great question, Mick. Thank you very much. All right. We have got another former guest. Here we go.
Good evening, folks. This is Ken McNabb speaking with his voice from Scotland. I have two questions. The first one is, which of the Beatles do you think would have been an ideal fit in the Ruttles? Personally, I'm going for Ringo because I never quite rated Barry Wom's drumming, and I think that would ensure a self-fulfilling prophecy if Ringo was to join the Ruttles. And the second question is this. I've been doing some research for a possible new project, and it strikes me that in early 1963, especially on the night that the Beatles first met Jane Asher, and 2 months later on at Paul McCartney's 21st birthday party, John Lennon's behaviour was absolutely lamentable. He was like a social hand grenade, And the question is, why do people think that Paul was prepared to tolerate John's occasionally appalling conduct? You know, what was the unique quality that held them together through so many different controversies? Okay, over to you.
All right, so which of the Beatles would have been an ideal fit for the Ruttles?
Well, I think it would be George. I mean, he's already in the movie. I mean, he already had that relationship with Eric Idle and the rest of the Pythons. I know that John liked the film quite a bit and thought it was hilarious, even though it portrays him as having run off with the daughter of Hitler. That appealed to his perverse sense of humor. No one's ever asked Yoko what she thought of that movie. I'd be curious what her opinion is. I know that Paul didn't like it, which I always thought odd because I know Paul has a great sense of humor, but I don't know. I guess Eric Idle's mugging for the camera was too much for him. But I would say, you know, if I were going to drop a Beatle in there, I'd put, well, Paul's a terrible actor, as we know from his scenes were cut from Help. And didn't he have one in A Hard Day's Night that was also cut?
Yeah, that was cut, yeah.
So, and we give my regards to Broad Street. Paul's astonishingly wonderful at so many things, but acting's not one of them. So I would say John and George.
Yeah, I'm surprised that you're surprised that Paul didn't like that. The clip, it's not Till There Was You, but whatever the parody of that is. Right. Where he's playing for the Queen, yeah. Another thing with the Ruttles, I did on Ed Chen's show, we did an audio commentary. Watch Eric Idle's fingers when he's playing bass. He's just waggling all four fingers.
Yes, that's true.
Oh,
yes.
I love it. It's so good. So I'm going to say George and Ringo. George, as you said, he would have been well into it. I think I said in part one, there's a sort of division between the Beatles. I think John and George were the most keen to smash the myth. And they were the ones that couldn't deal with the showbiz bullshit, basically. Paul seems to like it. Ringo seems to tolerate it. So I think taking the piss out of it, as we'd say in England, is a good way to do that. And I think of the four Ruttles, I think the two most memorable are Neil Innes, R.I.P., as Ron Nasty, and then Eric Idle as Dirk. So yeah, I'd definitely say George and Ringo. The actor who played Ringo was also in The Ruttles Part 2, which the title was pretty good, Can't Buy Me Lunch. But apparently the film was fairly dreadful.
Yeah, I can't think of the guy's name now who played Barry Wham, but he did a podcast, and he didn't have much good to say about that sequel.
Yeah. All right, let's get on to the second of Ken's questions. By the way, I told the story before of when Ken was on the show, but just to summarize, he was probably expecting to do quite a short show, but we went month by month as per his book, and we'd already done an hour and a half and got to about April. And of course, you can't suddenly fast forward to December. But Ken was a great sport, and he's possibly the loveliest man in the world. So he wrote a great book, and in the end, The Last Days of the Beatles. So the second one, just to summarise, for people who don't know, the Jane Asher thing was the first time they met her. John was drunk and asked her, how do women masturbate or something. The prim and proper Miss Asher wasn't very impressed with that. Don't know what the other boys thought about that. But not to excuse John, but I think you'll find all the episodes of this really bad behaviour, he's almost certainly drunk or on the way to being drunk. Not to excuse it, but on the last show, I was telling Alan Parry that I had a friend at school who used to do terrible things when he was drunk, but it was so clear to me that he had no control over it. Right. It was just clear from the sort of confused look he had in his eyes. His eyeballs were dancing circles, whatever the expression. Right. So why do you think Paul tolerated John's behaviour?
Well, I mean, for really the same reasons. I had friends that really got into some terrible behavior, but I stuck with them. You have that loyalty. And those guys were similar. I'm not saying that Paul would have gotten drunk and beaten up Bob Wooler, but they were very, very similar. We were always talking about their differences, but their life, the situations with their mothers, and they have the same interest in music and the same interest in art and they're so similar in many ways. And who knows, maybe Paul secretly got a kick out of that Jane Asher question. I mean, he may have actually been wondering.
He probably wanted to ask her. And thought,
right, yeah. I mean, both he and John would go around and tell someone that their mother was dead for a gag. So Paul has a twisted sense of humor too. And when that Bob Wooler incident happened, that was right when the Beatles were really taking off. So that would kind of be the wrong time to kick John out of the band. As heinous as that was, again, we're not making excuses for that behavior. That's not good. But, there's a career on the line there.
There's always an argument, does alcohol bring out your real personality or does it create a monster? You know, that kind of thing.
I don't think it brings out the real personality. I mean, clearly, John, had no trouble with Brian Epstein. So it's not homophobia in that traditional sense. I don't know what you would call it. He was mortified by this insinuation that he was having an affair with Brian Epstein, but he loved Brian. So, I mean, it's so complicated, then you throw booze on top of it.
Well, maybe, I was going to say, if you and I ever meet, I'll get drunk and you can see my real personality.
I'll stick by you, Anthony.
It's not that bad. No, I have a couple of theories. To me, it's fairly clear, actually. I think on the one hand, there's a lovely bit in Mark Lewison's Tune In where it says something along the lines of Paul and George decided they were going to stick with John because he was worth it. He was good enough value. Because John, of course, had that crazy period just after Stu Sutcliffe died. His quote unquote first lost weekend, as the Beatles naked put it. And then I think there's a practical reason. As you said quite rightly, cutting off the Beatles, what do you call it? Not bandwagon, but the juggernaut. Cutting off the Beatles juggernaut would have been just like the worst, terrible idea. And I think John, Paul, and I'd put Dylan in this category as well. If you watch documentaries about him, they were all ruthlessly ambitious. They all wanted to make it. And obviously, it's a lot of people say it's 1,000,000 to 1 shot, making it in the music industry. So why would you blow it? And I think John's apology to Bob Wooler was probably about as convincing as Elvis's telegram on Ed Sullivan in terms of them actually penning it. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
Anyway, there was just one other thing I was going to say, kind of a sidebar. I've always been fascinated by how people's memories can be so different. And we hear all this stuff in psychology. They talk about a lot. Eyewitnesses to like a road accident or something. One person will swear it was a green car. Another person will swear it was a yellow car, something like that. And there's a good TED talk about that as well. But I actually met Bob Wooler in 1998 at the Liverpool Convention. And I had a quick chat with him. And he was on stage with Alistair Taylor. These were in the days where all these guys were still around. Unfortunately, so many of them aren't anymore. And they were arguing about the Raymond Jones, having a friendly argument. Because Alistair Taylor said he put the name Raymond Jones. Again, for those who don't know, this guy supposedly asked for My Bonnie. Brian did know who the Beatles were. The story was that he didn't. But anyway, that's by the by. Bob Wooler said there was no Raymond Jones. I put the name in. And then Bob Wooler said, I knew Raymond. He was a nice young lad or something. And it's just fascinating to see two people who've got no reason to lie can have such different memories. Amazing. Anyway, thanks for those questions, Ken. And I'm sure you'll be back on the show again. Definitely. We're kind of on the home stretch here. Here we go. Next one.
Hi, Anthony. This is Leo from Madrid, Spain. I am a big fan of your podcast, and I have a question for you. What is, in your opinion, and apart from Beatles, the best group in the 60s and 70s? Thank you so much, Anthony. Have a nice day.
Okay, best groups of the 60s and 70s apart from the Beatles. Well, the way I think about this, when I was at college in the 90s, I met a few people who really didn't like the Beatles at all. And they tended to be metalers. Right. I was never really a metaler myself, but I used to dress a bit like a metaler. And, I had a friend who used to play, he was our designated driver because he was the only one who'd learned to drive at that point. He used to play Slayer and Metallica and stuff. I think there's a way of looking at things where there were bands that were doing what the Beatles couldn't do. So, I like Helter Skelter. I mean, it's a great recording, but I wouldn't call it heavy metal. I don't even call Led Zeppelin heavy metal, but I think Led Zeppelin, for example, did stuff the Beatles couldn't do it. A lot of it comes down maybe to even ability, because as much as I love Ringo, as much as I love George, to me, they're not John Bonham and Jimmy Page, and Paul wasn't John Paul Jones. And I'm not even saying necessarily better or worse, but there were things that Led Zeppelin, I think, could do that the Beatles couldn't do. So I put them there. Lyrics-wise, I don't think they could do what Dylan did. Yeah. And it doesn't work so much the other way around, because Dylan, I think, could write pop songs. So I'd say those two, for example. I love the Kinks. I think Ray Davies is peerless in many ways. What do you reckon? Go on. Just check out.
Yeah,
a few
I mean,
names.
for 60s, the Kinks would be my number 2 if I'm thinking British acts, followed by the Who. Then the Rolling Stones would be down the list a bit. American acts, Beach Boys, Doors, Velvet Underground, and then 70s. I'm kind of all over the place in the 70s, but I actually did a Facebook post on this recently. Very early Pink Floyd from 67 up through Dark Side and Wish You Were Here. I love that middle period that people tend not to speak about, records like More and Obscured by Clouds and things like that. And I'm a big fan of Queen during that period, during the 70s.
Bowie, of course.
I think individual artists, then you get in, especially the 70s, it does seem to be more individual. I like Roxy Music a lot, early 70s.
Oh, sorry, Leo said groups in the, sorry, I took that as acts.
Yeah.
Like I say, I think the Beatles could rock hard, but I think there were bands that maybe rocked a bit harder. But it's just a different thing. It's kind of, I don't think anyone did what the Beatles did better than them, except, but as you said, maybe Ray Davis. There's kind of
he's in it. All of these groups are operating. I mean, in terms of the 60s acts, I mean, the Kinks don't really sound anything like the Beatles. They have their own style. The Beach Boys really don't either. Certainly the Doors don't. I don't think of the Beatles when I'm hearing the Doors. I'm looking for something else from all of these different acts. So I'm getting something specific from these other acts, and I'm kind of getting everything with the Beatles. Maybe that's the way to put it.
I know 60s better than 70s. I mean, obviously a lot of bands are in both decades, but I did this thing a while ago. People used to talk about, wouldn't it be amazing to be in 1967 or 8 or 9 and thinking about all the new records that came out. And if you could indulge me, this won't take long, I promise. I actually made a note of all the albums that came out in a given year. So 68, okay, I won't name all the albums, but listen to this list of bands that all had new albums out at 68. Wait for this. The Byrds, The Velvet Underground, Frank Zappa, Simon and Garfunkel, The Small Faces, Pink Floyd, Creedence Clearwater Revival, The Doors, The Band, Cream, Big Brother and the Holding Company, which is Janis Joplin's original band, Jefferson Airplane, Jimi Hendrix, Captain Beefheart, Neil Young, The Beatles, The Kinks, Van Morrison, and The Rolling Stones, and The Soft Machine. I mean, if I was a record, I mean, I would have spent the whole year trying to catch up with those. And then, 69, I don't know which ones I've already mentioned, but you can add, then you've got Leonard Cohen, Joni Mitchell, The Stooges, Blind Faith, I think I said the band already, Nick Drake, King Crimson, David Bowie, The Grateful Dead. I mean, it just goes on and on. I mean, I know the 60s isn't everyone's bag, bit of a John Lennon thing there. But I mean, to me, that is just incredible. And of course, they all would have been on vinyl. They all tended to have great record covers. So it's absolutely spoilt for choice. Quite amazing.
I mean, when it comes to rock, though, I mean, I tend to like it all up until the early 2000s.
Right.
I mean, the 60s is kind of, rock reaches maturity, and it doesn't actually get any better. It sort of just goes off into different strains, and then we're just sort of expanding on ideas in the 70s, 80s, 90s. Is sort of how I look at it. And then it just becomes a spent force and passes away in the early 2000s. I mean, it continues like, model railroad enthusiasts continue, but it doesn't really have any big cultural reference these days.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying this is a fact by any means, but the last period that I remember was that period of the Strokes, the Hives, and the White Stripes.
Yeah, that was.
And there were other bands.
Hurrah.
I mean, that was. I mean, I thought the Strokes were just fantastic because they're doing something that's in one sense clearly not new, but they had a very, very distinctive sound. And
somewhere around 2004 or 5 is kind of when it started to fall apart. Anyway.
Yeah. All right, thanks for that, Leo. All right, we're on the home stretch. Here we go.
Hi, I'm Antony and I live in Valence in France, but I'm from Paris. I'm not a big fan of the Beatles, but I love music in general and I respect their work a lot and the incredible musical legacy they left. So my question is very simple. What are the best and worst John Lennon and Beatles songs for you?
Okay, so a bit of an old chestnut, this one, but it's always fun. So best and worst John Lennon solo and Beatles songs. I think we'll go a little bit quick fire because we're kind of coming to the end here.
Okay.
Let's say John Lennon solo. I'm going to say best. Obviously, there's a lot of classics. Since we did the 1970 show, I've just fallen in love more and more with the Plastic Ono Band album. I didn't buy the box set, but I sucked up a few of the things that appeared online. So I'm actually going to say God or Love, because they're such different songs. I think God, taking that doo-wop, the doo-wop chords that I mentioned earlier, you know, where you can play Stand By Me, You Really Got Hold of Me. John Lennon's great idea of taking that chord sequence and creating something that's so far from, you know, early Spectre. Ironic, of course.
Well, you know what it's really based? It's really based on Love Letters, the Kitty Lester Love Letters. It's the same piano flourishes, everything. If you hear it, you go, whoa, I see what he based it on, yeah.
Oh, it's another dream you've smashed for me. It's bad enough listening to Stew Ball, you know, that sounds like Happy Christmas, and that song that sounds exactly like the beginning of Revolution. Oh, no. Anyway, worst John Lennon songs. Yeah, there's a couple. There's one called Only People from the Mind Games album. I do like the Mind Games album, but I actually did a show about this with Jason Barnard of The Strange Brew. That was one of my favourite episodes. 33 and 34 from memory. Only People, yeah. It's got this sort of really sort of try Only People, and a bit of a ordinary tune. And then the other one was, I know Milk and Honey wasn't quite finished, but Forgive Me, My Little Flower Princess is all the worst things about the John and Yoko bullshit 1980 myth. And like I say, I don't think their early relationship was a myth at all. I think John Lennon found the thing he'd been waiting for all his life, as he said. But there's something about that 1980, the stuff they said to Peebles and that whole thing, it just doesn't feel right to me. So those are my two. So kind of quick fire, best and worst John Lennon solo songs.
John Lennon solo? Well, I mean, best, Give Me Some Truth. Worst? You know, unfortunately, it's not much of a solo career that there's too many. You know, there's not like a lot of best and worst really to choose from. It's such a small solo career. But I like everything about John Sinclair except for got to. It's not clever. It's not interesting. It's not funny. It's not anything other than annoying. It's the musical equivalent of somebody going, is this bothering you? Is this bothering you? Is this bothering you? Over and over again. I sort of get the idea of, well, he really wants to hit home that this has got to happen. But it comes across as very lazy to me. I like the rest of the song okay. That would be my worst. My issues with John Lennon's solo career have more to do with production than quality of the songs. I think the production on some of his records is abysmal. And I think string arrangements, there's so many sonic problems on his records. For me, you know, other people, more power to you if you love them, but I have problems with production.
Yeah, when Ken Womack was on a few months ago, we kind of had a very polite disagreement. That I said Double Fancy was overproduced, and he said, oh no, it was just right. But I love the Double Fancy stripped down. I think layering is a sign of insecurity, and I've got evidence of that, because when I've done songs and I haven't quite believed in the song, I've wanted to add more and more to it. So I can tell you that from experience.
But, you know, it's funny because it's not so much Double Fantasy, but, you know, for me, Imagine I have problems with. Like Jealous Guy, I can imagine the Carpenters hearing that and going, that's too much. It's too saccharine. I would like to hear that stripped of, I'm sure I can if I get the box set. Anyway, so I hope that answers that question there.
Yeah, maybe the fact that he decided to work for Spectre, I think the strings in that almost comes with the package, you know. The guns and the butcher's smock and all that. But anyway, quick fire. Best and worst Beatles songs. Obviously, so much to choose from. Again, my listeners will know what I'm going to say. The Holy Trinity of 67, Strawberry Fields, A Day in the Life, and I'm the Walrus. My Desert Island song would be Strawberry Fields all the way. I just think it, what do you say, psychodrama set to music. And psychoanalysis set to music. And with my psychology interest, I've got to say that one. Worst, there's a few. If the Nothing Is Real guys ever get to hear this, I did hear their show on Beatles for Sale, and they said it's a cliche to say that they sound tired and everything. I think Beatles for Sale is seriously front-loaded. I've always said that. And on the second side, there's a couple. We're talking about original songs, by the way. Let's say that rather than covers. Okay. I'd go with Maybe Every Little Thing, Maybe What You're Doing. I just think they're a bit ordinary. And then Don't Pass Me By, I think. Although, you know, I can honestly tell you there's hardly any Beatles songs I actually dislike. So go on, best and worst. Go for it.
Best for me, there's so many. I mean, Help, Rain, I Feel Fine, Can't Buy Me Love. I tend to skew more towards earlier material. Blackbird is up there, certainly. We mentioned Mother Nature's Son, which is just one of my favorites. That's just overall Beatles, not John Lennon specific. Worst, they don't really have a lot of worst. I mean, I was never a big fan of Yes, It Is. I think John's right when he said it's Son of This Boy. I think some of the harmonies are a bit wonky on that song. Yeah, it's not in the same class as This Boy. I like John's bridge on it, but You Like Me Too Much, there's some lazy songwriting going on there. I really do. It's like, oh, God.
Oh, yeah, that would be a contender, actually, that one, yeah.
The songs are never completely horrible, but there might be elements where you're like, oh, we could have done a better job.
Obviously, you could point to things like Wild Honey Pie, but I mean, I just disregard that. I think You Know My Name, Look Up the Number. It's really good. I think
I love that.
John and Paul are the most charismatic. Yeah. And I love when we did have the White Album question. I think Why Don't We Do It in the Road is a great experimental number, you know. So anyway, let's move on. We've got a couple of questions from Australia, in fact. Here we go.
G'day. Paul from Australia phoning in. How many Ruttles songs could have made it onto a Beatle album? How would the Beatles have fared today if they were born in 2000, 2002 and 2003? Would they have made it? Would they have made it through Idol? What would they have sounded like?
So let's tackle this Ruttles one. How many Ruttles songs could have made it onto a Beatles album? If I had to pick one, I must be in love. I feel good, la la la. I think that's damn good.
Yeah. Let's Be Natural, that song. For me is, I mean, that's one of those ones where Neil Innes gets so eerily close to John, it might as well be John.
I would say Love Life as well. Love.
Yeah.
I think what you could do with Ruttles songs is take out the bit that's obviously the comedic parody bit. So from Love Life, you know, obviously they parodied the Marseillaise with that. Right. Maybe take that out and maybe change that. I like Get Up and Go, but then the lyrics are so funny, like, you know, stuff like One Horse Town. And
well, that opening, that's Battle Hymn of the Republic on Love Life.
Is that right? Yeah. All right. And so this is the final question. How would the Beatles have fared if they were around now? That was what he said. And what would they have sounded like if they were coming up in the 2000s?
Well, they'd all be in flashy outfits and dancing in unison on stage, and some guy in Sweden would be writing everything. I think he said
2000. I think he said 2000s where there was still a bit of rock going on.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, I don't know of any rock bands of the British rock bands of the early 2000s that would they have been like the Kaiser Chiefs or something?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. For me, the point is that if they were great songwriters, it wouldn't necessarily matter when they came up, I suppose. Yeah, it's so hard to know because it's this old sort of it's this parallel universe without the Beatles. Leaving aside
it's that movie.
Leaving aside that shit. No. I'm not going to mention that. There's a great Ray Davies documentary. I think it's called. Is it called Imaginary Man? Did he have a song called Imaginary Man?
I can't. I just saw it on YouTube. It's from like 10 years ago, right?
Yeah, you've got to watch that. Yeah. There's a clip. I think he's in a church hall or something. And he's playing like an old out-of-tune piano. And he said the way to know a good song is, does it sound good on an old out-of-tune piano? And he proceeds to play Waterloo Sunset. And, of course, it sounds great. And I don't think he wasn't blowing his own trumpet because, you know, he was just mentioning one song that he was proud of. But I think the songwriting would have found a way. And,
they would have written really different songs with totally different influences. God knows what they would have been influenced by. But
yeah, perhaps we could have a sort of conclusion to this whole. And thank you very much to the listeners for these fantastic questions. I've had a blast.
Yeah.
Let's just conclude perhaps by saying that, in any era, good songwriting finds a way. And I think the Beatles, it's hard to know, but I think that there must have been an innate thing in John, Paul and George as well, really, with the songwriting, that they were always going to do something different, that they were always going to have that instinct to say, well, we've done that, you know, a restlessness. And if you listen to Beatles songs, one of the first things I learned is that they're always just packed with value. So when you get to the second verse, it'll have a different word or a different chord change, you know? And so it's this restlessness and this instinct for innovation. So to answer Paul's question, I think they would have sounded slightly different, but they would have made it no matter what era.
And they'd be YouTube influencers now,
that's it.
because you'd have to have some other component other than just music. You'd have to have something else,
Yeah. All right. Hey, listen, I'm going to let you go, mate. Thank you very much for being on the show.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure.
Yeah.
I hope you got everything there. That's going to be a heck of an editing job. You've got 5 different files to deal with, right?
And we had a little mishap, which I may or may not share with the listeners. It was my fault. Maybe I'll share it.
It's mine. I had to leave. If I hadn't answered the call of nature,
that's true.
We would have just sailed right through.
My
morning cup of coffee did me in.
Yeah, and I'm not going to tell the listeners exactly, but you and I are going to be working together again. Well, I don't call it work, but having a fun talk again. You're going to be on my film podcast, talking about a certain wayward actor who gets mentioned a lot on Glass Onion. So I will leave that with the listeners. They almost certainly, regular listeners will guess who we're talking about. But that's going to be fun. But listen, thank you very much once again, Ghosty, and thanks to the listeners for all the amazing questions.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
All right, all the best. Bye.